So are you highly sensitive or are you also autistic? Today's video is about the 13 reasons why, or the 13 differentiators from high sensitivity as opposed to autism. And that if you relate to more of these or understand these concepts and find them helpful, it could be, not is, but could be possible that you might want to explore an autism diagnosis, an understanding of yourself in some way. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist, and I have been, I would say, highly sensitive my whole life. And I discovered this concept last year, about a year and a half ago, of understanding high masking autism. And through lots of research that I post here and other places, through books and articles, and watching autistic creators and learning from them and those who do testing, all of that has informed where I sort of sit today. I think I said that weird, but that's where we are, okay? So in terms of the overlap between HSPs, highly sensitive people, and autistic people, it is quite large and massive. And this is one of the big reasons why many in the autistic community believe that HSP is just code for autism. And those who are more HSP say, no, there are differences. And I found some research articles, I'll link below, some websites, but I do think there's so much overlap that we can get into trouble. Where I think it's a problem is if you feel like you're an HSP and then you realize you're autistic, if yourself or those around you don't support more awareness and knowledge and understanding, and that keeps you from getting or creating a life that's more helpful, that's where it's most important. So fundamentally, when we talk about autism versus high sensitivity is a trait. It is a temperament, it is a part of a sensitivity to the world, to ourselves, that we're often born with. And many people say in some research articles from 15 to 30% of the population is just kind of comes out of the womb more sensitive. Autism, on the other hand, is a neurodevelopmental and neurological disorder that affects how people interact with others, how they communicate, how they learn, how they behave, how they engage in the world. And so theoretically, we're talking about issues, yes, with high sensitivity, perhaps, to everything and everyone, but also at the core, difficulty with communication and interaction with others, a tendency towards special interests, restricted interests, and repetitive behaviors, a strong preference for routines, and other symptoms that can make life quite challenging, from self-care to work to school to relationships in general. So at the core, both of them overlap significantly. They both overlap HSP and autism in areas around sensory sensitivities, although a sensory processing sensitivity, which is basically a formal word often for an HSP, is a highly sensitive kind of response to the world and yourself, different or versus from a sensory processing disorder, which is often much more impactful in terms of how they're both can be impactful, but the ways in which it shows up are much more complicated in terms of neurological dynamics, okay? And that can be sensory seeking versus sensory responsiveness, things like that, where in a sensory sensitivity, it's more like a sensitivity. You're not going to see a seeking behavior, I don't believe, like you would in maybe ADHD or autism, okay? So sensory issues, a lot of maybe value-driven behaviors. Those who are sensitive to the world are theoretically not going to like violence and injustice. They're going to have a heart for other people. They're going to be, both of them, deeply impacted by verbal and nonverbal communication. That's that hypervigilance piece, especially if you're a child, which I think historically in the parenting world, to have gentle, sensitive parents is becoming more common, but it certainly was not. And I keep saying that I think a lot of us who have whatever it is, high sensitivity, autism, ADHD, all of these things, trauma, also had parents who had trauma, right? Who didn't know how to self-soothe, who were dysregulated, made us walk on eggshells, things like that. So we're used to scanning for tone. So we're deeply impacted by things like anger, unhappiness, fear, things like that. Both can have a deep and inner world like processing style, deep thinkers, although the processing style is a little bit different in autism, and we'll talk about that. Both can cognitively overload themselves and, get themselves where they're kind of like easily overwhelmed by too many things. too many people, stimuli. Both can need alone time to self-regulate, can enjoy isolation or downtime or recovery time and may need it. Both have sensitive nervous systems, like I'm saying, generally. So maybe a stronger fight or flight, a greater reactivity to the world. Both can have difficulty in like transitions and new environments and warming up. They can have difficulty in adjusting to, things that create a sense of the unknown. So we can see a lot of anxiety, and you can definitely see big feelings in both, right? And so we're going to have possibly dynamics on the sensitive side that are going to lean one way, and that's going to be more of this like, I'm going to read the summary here on Elaine Aron's website when she talks about high sensitivity. So things like, if you're more HSP, highly sensitive to lights, smells, fabrics, sirens, getting rattled when you have a little bit of time and a lot to do, making a point of avoiding violence, shows, needing to be in quiet darkness and to recover, needing to set up your life in a way that is less impactful and stressful for you, having a fine appreciation for things like music, the arts, the kind of beauty in the world, even things you eat, your palate, things like that, and having a deep and rich, complex life, and maybe perhaps being a shy or more sensitive child. Now, that is kind of like the picture, right? That's where it kind of ends. So what I want you to get about that is that it is this like, I'm sensitive to the world and to things that are deeply impactful, but I'm not going to have these next 13 things. So in order to look at the signs, I want to start with two things that are not really signs, but might help you further understand HSP and really autism at the core. Number one is to go to the website called embraceautism.com and to consider taking their online tests. Now, the conversation around self-diagnosis has been varied. I do believe it's a very valid conversation, and I do believe there's research supporting that it can be. So the chances are, if you take the tests and they look leaning towards autism, if you've looked at other people's research or videos and you've done your own work, and most autistic people will, and you think you are, there's a very good chance that you are. The question then becomes, what do you do about it? And while this video is not about getting a diagnosis, it's important to understand that getting a diagnosis may or may not help you, so please research that before you consider it. What can be helpful is the validation, the accommodations, the way you set up your life, and of course that depends what level your needs are. If you're on a higher needs level dynamic, you might not have a choice, or you're a parent of a child that has autism. So we're talking here about high masking, but I want to make space for the very important spectrum of autism, all right? Number two, and especially the AQ. The AQ in many articles I found was a really good filter for, and you'll see it on Embrace Autism. Number two, to watch autistic creators on YouTube, on TikTok, on Instagram. Like, I really do think that it will start to change your mind about a stereotype you have if you watch it, and it may make you less inclined to say, oh my God, this is a trend. By the way, seeking and understanding patterns is very common in autism. And I was thinking the other day about me recognizing this kind of emerging topic, not as like a trend, but seeing it growing about 1.5 years ago. And I've done that with lots of things, like the cupcake, trends, just all kinds of stupid things. But I think my brain kind of is good at seeing patterns, and that is very common in autism, okay? So now let's get into what the bulk of it looks like. Now, these could also happen in some regard. You could say this is part of my sensitivity, but at the core, I do not believe you will find these things when it comes to autism. Number one, you're highly sensitive to everything and everyone. That one probably has the most overlap with HSP, but the bottom line is that the world is an intense place. And you are, if you're autistic, much more deeply dysregulated by it. It's not like, oh, I don't like that. It's like, I'm going to shut down for today. I am overstimulated. That those lights are giving me a migraine, things like that. And so it really is this like, it is the one big overlap, highly sensitive. The next one, there's a trail of broken friendships in your past in some way. You might be great at making friends, but the research shows you have not been great at maintaining them. Along those lines, as I've talked about, socializing, social issues, needing recovery time, being in a social environment like a classroom with your kids and freaking out and like trying to leave as soon as you can. I've discussed networking events. I was realizing that every single event I went to for my kids, because I wanted to be there, if it involved having to interact, I hated it. I would never eat the food that people brought because I was afraid it would make me sick. Like, it's so crazy. I have this whole thing with like buffets, but they're passing around, oh, the chicken salad Barb made or whatever. I sound like I'm 80. And I'd be like, no, thank you. I already ate. But like the whole thing being above my head, not knowing who to talk to, trying to find someone to like sit with, and being panicked if the one or two mom friends I didn't know wasn't there. Feeling misjudged, being labeled by people certain things like they're stuck up or they're not nice or whatever. Being called a loner, needing a lot of recovery time. So do you see the picture I'm painting? It's not just like, oh, I'm sensitive and I don't know how to deal with conflict and maybe that hurt my feelings, which is very common in autism as well, or can be, or being overly direct and maybe not filtering enough, also common in autism. Not so common at all in HSP, because you're going to be so worried about others. You're not going to be hyper-focused on everything around your body, and you're socializing in that regard. You may be shy, but it's like this panic. And or you're kind of like, don't really have good awareness of social cues. And so you've offended people. You've been too blunt. You've been too direct, and you don't see what the problem is. You don't trust people, right? All of that in terms of social dynamics, they don't feel safe is the part of the trust. So there's a huge piece around social deficits. And people who are HSP don't tend to have as many social deficits at all. In fact, for many of them, they actually, in a good social situation, really enjoy that. And it says that some autistics, we might like, it might not be terrible, but it doesn't give us the same intrinsic reward for many of us that it does for other people. The next one is a bottom-up processing style. So autism often involves a deep bottom-up processing style, which is part of how we take in everything and we kind of work our way into understanding things, and that is not as characteristic of HSPs. The next one is special interests and repetition. Autistic individuals tend to have special interests, restricted things they want to talk about, they care about. And yes, as some research has talked about, for those like high-masking women who therapy, psychology, art, science, literature, the arts, all of those may be more common female topics that don't get recognized as, yes, you know a lot about that. And by the way, that's the only thing you know about, right? Or that's the thing you were in for years. And the need for repetition. So having routines and that not being predictable, being very, once again, dysregulating for autistic people. So routine brings comfort. Predictability brings comfort. Now, that could be true in HSP, like, oh, it's a new environment, but nowhere nearly as dysregulating and not going to be so rigid potentially in terms of those interests, which we don't see in HSP, those special interests, and we don't tend to see the kind of hardcore desire for routine. Now, by the way, if you also have ADHD and you are autistic, that's a big sabotager. We're not going to discuss ADHD in this video, but you might have pieces where part of your brain craves routine and part craves novelty, and that can be very common, but we're pretending today, for example, that ADHD kind of doesn't exist, okay? Autism has, the next one is a communication style that tends to be more literal, more direct, more kind of authentic. It makes us, I think, in many regards, for most of us, hate small talk, want to skip right into the trauma bonding or the deep conversations, which is fine, but sometimes socially we don't have the tolerance or desire or ability to build that up. We should be like getting to know each other, right? So you're not going to see that kind of, like I was mentioning earlier, more likely to maybe even offend people, and not mean to, but be like, well, I don't like this, I don't like that, or why are you doing this, or why would you think that? Things like that. The next one is self-soothing. So we're talking about stimming in autism. You're not going to see this in HSPs, right? So this, whether it's, I've talked about the blanket, the satin on the blanket, skin picking, nail picking, all kinds of rocking, flapping, hair twirling, repeating certain phrases over and over and over again, lyrics, watching things over and over again. A lot of those things can be stimming. They're a form of self-soothing that can be helpful in like anxious situations, but also be deeply comforting and enjoyable. The next one is needing structure. So many autistic people, in the classic way, you've seen them line things up, have order, categorize things. That can very much be possible. If you have the ADHD part, it could be, once again, like I'm saying, sabotaging of that. But you're not going to see that kind of like structural rigidity or desire in HSPs. The next one is context independent. So this is what it says, is that the autistic brain does not subcortically pick up context cues and values authenticity across various situations. What that means is that we have to have, it's not intuitive to pick up things. We have to have effort and desire and conscious motivation that is happening as part of our prefrontal cortex to understand like the context clues of like where are we and what's happening in like a restaurant with the menus. It might make somebody want to go online with autism, for example, and read the menu first to know what to expect, to map out the restaurant or the environment. You're not going to see that need for context and the inability to not to have to work to read context clues with HSP. The next one is the variance in empathy. So obviously with an HSP, there's going to be a lot of empathy most likely, right? That's the whole core. You are sensitive to yourself, to the world, to people. Well, with people on the autism spectrum, we can see hyper, a lot of empathy, and hypo, not so much. So that is going to vary in many ways. But it is also not true that if you can, for example, make eye contact and be empathic, you're not autistic. Because of our massive, need to mask, we might be counting in our mind how long we're holding eye contact or trying to research in our little catalog of the things we're supposed to say if we have empathy differences or, dynamics. But the point is that should be much more intuitive for an HSP. And then the last two things are looking at not just the context clues, but the social cues of autistic people. So this requires, once again, more effort, more work to know what to do, to know what to say, how do friends respond, how do coworkers greet each other, things like that, body language. So it requires much more effort for autistic people. So even a shy HSP, though, is going to understand that much more intuitively. And lastly, we know if you are on the spectrum, there's a much higher chance that you have connective tissue disorders. If you're a woman, PCOS, I'm just mentioning Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, fibromyalgia, a lot of these allergies, a lot of things like that tend to be more common in those with autism. So we don't necessarily see those. I don't know the research on HSPs, although I could understand if you're more sensitive, maybe your body is also to things like the environment and illness, but there is definitely in some research articles a correlation between these dynamics. And lastly, because both of them often have trauma, whether you're sensitive and so things are more traumatic, or like the recent research we just saw about those with autism being more likely to develop PTSD to even mild stressors, in other words, things that those who are not autistic would not get trauma from. It means that we are much more responsive and sensitive to our environments. And so I think that's where it gets confusing, is that to be autistic, I do believe, is to have some level of high sensitivity to some parts of your life, maybe more than others, and that's where it gets stuck. So I think we have to keep talking about it. I don't know that I'm fully convinced that HSP isn't code for autism. There's, like I said, link an article down below that says that they're not. But the bottom line is that I think if you identify with HSP, you go take a bunch of the tests, you go do the readings, and you relate to those things, it might be helpful for you to do a little more self-awareness and knowledge around what might help you set up your life in a way if you are autistic or have autistic, subclinical traits that help you function better. Because, like I've said, it has been life-changing for me to understand why I am bothered by everything and everyone, and to do more things like build in recovery time, let me do my schedule a certain way, stop feeling bad and ashamed for certain things, work on certain areas around, how I engage in the world, things like that. So anyway, that is it. I hope this was helpful. I hope you have a beautiful day, and I will see you soon.